Welcome to Interdisciplinary Conversations, a series of public Zoom roundtables hosted by the Interdisciplinary Honors Program at Loyola University Chicago. These roundtables bring together academics and experts from Loyola University Chicago and beyond to discuss contemporary topics. Tonight, in addition to our panelists, I'd like to give a special welcome to students and faculty from the English Department, the Modern Languages and Literatures Department, the Interdisciplinary Honors Program, and the International Students and Scholars at Loyola, as well as to members of the Carleton University community in Ottawa, Ontario. Once our panelists have had a chance to discuss their research into the representation of immigration in various literatures and films, we'll let our audience be heard. So please leave your questions in the Q&A section of Zoom. And please leave your microphones and videos on mute at all times. This roundtable is being recorded, and that recording will be posted to the IHP YouTube channel and on our website. Once this program is, once this program is up on our website, I will also be able to post a recommended reading or viewing list to accompany it. I'm Professor Virginia Strain, a Canadian by birth, a Shakespeare scholar by training, and the director of the IHP. This is not NPR, and I'd like to warn you that we might be interrupted by my toddler or two dogs really at any moment during this conversation. Let me just make sure that I turn on all of the videos here and make sure that everybody is up and running. Is there anyone we're missing? No, we're all here. Okay. So first I'd like to introduce Professor Le-Khac. Dr. Le-Khac is Assistant Professor of English at Loyola University Chicago. His research and teaching focus on 20th and 21st century American literature, Asian American studies, Latinx studies, relational race studies, migration studies, narrative theory, and digital humanities. He is the author of Giving Form to an Asian and Latinx America from Stanford Press, coming out in 2020. Following a shared form of storytelling across Asian American and Latinx communities, this book reveals their intertwined histories and political struggles. It illuminates the Asian and Latinx America that the U.S. has become through mass migration in the last 5 decades, and makes the case for a cross-racial solidarity that will be central to the minority-majority future. His work appears in Post-45, American Literature, MELUS, Victorian Studies, and the N+1 book series. Professor Julia Elsky is an assistant professor of French in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures at Loyola. She is also the undergraduate program director of French. She completed her PhD in French at Yale University, and her research relates to modern French literature and culture with a focus on literature and the Second World War, immigrant authors in France, and Jewish identity in France. Her first book, Writing Occupation, Jewish Emigre Voices in Wartime France, will be published this December. Her next book, her current book project, is about the playwright Eugene Ionesco and the origins of the theater of the absurd in the Second World War. Last year, she completed a Southland Fellowship at the United States Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Dr. Malini Guha is an associate professor of film studies at Carleton University. Her first book, From Empire to the World, Migrant London and Paris in Cinema, is a study of cinematic London and Paris from the perspective of migration, globalization, and the end of empire in a British and French context. Her work has been published in journals such as Screening the Past and the Journal of British Cinema and Television. As a contributing editor for the online journal Mediopolis, she writes a regular column, Screening Canada, where she explores an aspect of Canada's mediated placemaking in relation to recent issues concerning its global role and domestic negotiation of racial and ethnic difference. Dr. Eliana Vagalau is Assistant Professor of French at Loyola University. Her research on Francophone Caribbean literature and contemporary philosophy focuses on the relationship between aesthetics and politics, as well as on questions of transnationalism, diaspora, and gender. She has published articles on the work of Haitian authors Danny Lefourier, James Noel, and Jean-Claude Charles, and has co-edited a reader's guide to the latter's body of work. She is currently completing her first book manuscript on contemporary French Caribbean fiction. As a founding member of the Collectif Jean-Claude Charles, she dedicates much of her work to making visible the work of this fundamental Haitian author. Welcome, and thank you all for agreeing to share your research and insights with us today. And the order we've decided on is Professor Le-Khac. He's going to start off with his introduction.
Let me try to share my screen here. Fingers crossed. Does that work? All right. First, I just want to thank Virginia for organizing this event and thank my panelists for being, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And thank you to the audience for showing up to like one more Zoom thing, like on any given day, especially special thanks to some of my students I see in the audience. Thanks for showing up. So I'm really interested in this idea of immigration and imagination. And my first kind of way of looking into it is the idea that imaginative literature intervenes in immigration politics through its form, like the way it shapes stories. So in this first slide, I'm trying to lay out three convictions here. That storytelling form matters artistically in our immigration literature, it matters politically in our immigration policies, and it matters analytically in helping us see connections and alliances between potentially seemingly separate migrant groups. So let me give an example of that. We can ask a seemingly simple question like, where do you begin the story of refugees? So if we think of the tradition of American immigrant stories, it kind of looks like this. In this tradition, this is where the story starts. They tend to see the home country as a setting of the past and dead ends, and the protagonist needs to escape that in order to come to America, which is a setting of the future and opportunities, right? So the real action in these stories is in the US. That's where the standard tropes kind of come in, like learning the language, learning the customs, humble beginnings, the rise to success, all those things, right? So the story here starts when you arrive in the US. And this is a really influential tradition, and it shapes how we think of people who arrive in the US, even refugees. And it shapes our policies toward refugees. So here's one way to tell the story of Iraqi and Syrian refugees. One way to tell this, we start with the arrival in the US, is that these refugees are victims who are saved by the US. They owe us because it's an act of charity to take them in. And we can cut off help to these refugees whenever, because we're not forced to do charity as a nation, right? And there are some in Washington who tell the story this way. So let me show you a different way we can tell this story. In this other telling, the US invades a region, destabilizes it, and directly or indirectly displaces millions of people. In this story, the refugees don't owe us, America owes them. The nation has a political responsibility to those displaced by our military actions. So what seems like this kind of like literary quibble, like, well, where should we start a story, is actually a really consequential political choice. So I'm interested in asking, like, what if our stories of US immigration broke out of this straitjacket and were able to recognize the messier stories of the US acting out in the world and leading to migrations that come to the US in turn? What if our immigration stories took far more seriously the idea that people don't just leave their homelands lightly? What if we asked why people emigrated from their homelands in the first place, not just why people immigrate to the US, right? So many writers from communities of color formed by migration are doing exactly this kind of work. And that's what's really interesting to me. So that's what kind of powers my first book, called Giving Form to Asian Latinx America, came out in the spring. And one of my main interests in this book is the way that writers from the two fastest growing immigrant groups, Latinxes and Asian Americans, are arriving at these like really strikingly similar shapes for telling their migration stories. And I kind of think that similar shapes of storytelling can be clues, suggesting that there are links here that we haven't seen before, right? So let me give an example of that, of those kind of links. So two really beautiful Cold War fictions are by Juno Diaz, Drown, and Amy Phan, We Should Never Meet. Juno Diaz is Dominican American, Amy Phan is Vietnamese American. But they arrive at a really similar shape in their storytelling. It's really fragmented. They leave gaps in the migration story. They jump back and forth between third world countries and the US, the past and the present. In effect, through the way they're shaping their stories, they're arguing that how interconnected the past and the present, the third world and the US are, right? And when we read their literatures together, we can explore a history that isn't recognized by many Americans. That is, that millions of Asian Americans and Latinxes are here because the US military was in their countries during the Cold War. So if we think of Cold War migrations at all as Americans, we often think of the Vietnam War and the refugees it created, right? But when I started reading these literatures together, I saw a more intimate connection here between the Vietnam War and another war that we have totally forgotten as Americans. In 1965, the US invaded the Dominican Republic. We don't remember this, right? But when we do this comparison, we get to link two scenes that are like half a world apart, right? Let me do this. Right. That's better. First scene, March 8, 1965, the Marines land at Da Nang, and these are the first US combat troops in the Vietnam War. A month later, on April 28th, the 82nd Airborne lands in Santo Domingo, beginning the US invasion of the Dominican Republic. So they're less than 2 months apart, and these dates mark the moments when the Vietnamese and Dominican civil wars officially become American wars. Wars whose violence displaced over 1 million Vietnamese and hundreds of thousands of Dominicans to the United States. These seem like separate arenas of the world, right? But the escalation of the Vietnam War actually shaped the decision to invade the Dominican Republic. President Johnson was like really worried. We were like in Vietnam, and he was like, how do we show that we're really strong now that we started this war, right? Now that we're in it. As he put it, what can we do in Vietnam if we can't clean up the Dominican Republic? Now, there's the connection then between these two US invasions, 10,000 miles apart. And that connection, really interestingly, was not lost on Dominicans, as you can see from this really striking image from the streets of Santo Domingo. The graffiti here, Fuera Yankees de Vietnam, translates as Yankees out of Vietnam. So it's demonstrating this kind of Latin American Asian solidarity with another country that's dealing simultaneously with a US invasion. Now, when we see that connection, we can see now that like Dominican migrants and Vietnamese migrants are linked, their fates are linked. But when they arrive in the US, they're actually categorized differently. The Vietnamese were entering the US as refugees, and the Dominicans were coded as immigrants. So I'm trying to help us see like the complication of this immigrant-refugee divide. The US invasion was the primary cause of Dominicans fleeing the Dominican Republic, but the US accommodated those fleeing Dominicans under immigrant and even tourist visas, astonishingly. And why was that? Because US refugee policy was focused on those people fleeing communist countries, such as Vietnam. So the refugee category had a political function, and it couldn't recognize people like the Dominicans who were escaping countries suffering under US invasions and US-backed governments, right? The image of the Vietnamese like fleeing communism to the US was really good for our national image. The Dominicans fleeing US invasion, not so much. So we don't want to recognize them as refugees. But what's really striking is that when they coded Dominicans as immigrants, it still accomplished this like really impressive feat of reinforcing stories about US immigrant opportunity, even in the middle of a US invasion, right? So US Marines are fighting on the streets of Santo Domingo. Hundreds of people try to flee and they mob the US embassy trying to get out. And the embassy interprets this mob in a pretty amazing way. USA, still land of promise here, they cabled to the State Department in Washington. So there's like a political function here of the immigrant and the refugee category, and they're really intertwined, right, is what I'm trying to suggest. So finally, this intertwining is really true for Vietnamese too. They may have entered the US as refugees, but that doesn't prevent our media from putting them into kind of immigrant stories of economic success, as if the reason Vietnamese were in the US were economic opportunity and not the fact that their homeland had been utterly devastated by a US-led war. So I'll just end here by laying out a few terms that the literature of these communities help us reimagine as way more intertwined than usual. The US and the third world, US actions abroad, and immigrants from abroad coming to our country, emigration and immigration, Latinx migrations, Asian American migrations, the immigrant and the refugee. Those things are reimagined when we read these literatures. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Le-Khac. I hope we'll expand more on those terms, but that's a fantastic start, and I now wish I had a copy of your book here. I think with all of these presentations, we're going to discuss war and empire. In my world, in early modern or Renaissance studies, one of the outcomes of the explosion of social history in the later 20th century was a real displacement of older political and military narratives of history, right? And so really, though, that comes back into focus when you're talking about these topics. Why don't we move to Professor Elsky, who's going to take us to another war in another country.
Hello. Thank you so much for organizing this, Professor Strain. And it's really wonderful to be with you all. Let me just share my screen. Okay, sorry. Great, so I'll start today. My research is about Jewish immigrants to France and their experience of World War II. And I'll start by explaining how I came to this project, and then explain a little bit the kinds of archival research I do, and give two examples of very different experiences that Jewish immigrant authors had during the war. This is, I just recently got the cover of the book, so I wanted to, I couldn't help but put it on. Okay, my project began with my fascination with the Jewish novelist Irene Nemirovsky's poignant and ambivalent portrayals of France. And this actually began a long time ago when I was an undergraduate. I was part of a research program in my university, and I worked on one project throughout my studies. And in a French class, I learned about her and I got really interested in her. So a French class can change your life in college. But anyway, I ended up translating a short story of hers and doing some archival research. And through that, I continued my studies. And that's how, starting a long time ago, I began to work on this. But anyway, you can see Nemirovsky was born in Russia. And she came to France as a teenager in 1919 when her family fled the Bolshevik Revolution. And we can say, why France? Why did they go to France in particular? Among other reasons, but I'm using this as a kind of introduction. In this period, and especially a little bit later in the 1920s, France was, as it still is, a major destination for immigrants. After really massive loss of life in World War I on kind of an unimaginable scale in France, the French government eased immigration law to open the way for immigrants to have a workforce. And by 1926, 6% of the population of France were immigrants. So that's one reason why France. Another is that France was a major destination for Jewish immigrants because of the legacy of universalism. There's a Yiddish expression, living like God in France. So France has a really special place in Jewish memory. When I say universalism, I'm referring to the French Revolution and that creation of citizens and the idea that all citizens are equal, that there aren't different kinds of citizens. And in 1790, France emancipated Jewish people, which means gave them citizenship and civil rights. And it was the first country to ever do this. So if you compare this to Russia, where she's coming from, Jews did not have civil rights until 1917. So when she was growing up, her family had no rights. I could spend a long time talking about this, but unfortunately I don't have a lot of time. But in any case, this is the kind of world she came to in France as a republic and at a height of immigration. And she wrote a lot of books about Jewish immigrants, and they often deal with questions about adopting a new language, Jewish identity in France, accents, and sometimes the shame of having an accent, the difficulties of assimilating to a country. And there's a lot of debate about her work, actually, because in some texts, she has very stereotypically anti-Semitic themes. And so scholars debate this a lot. And at her time, people debated this a lot, actually, whether or not she was self-hating. Other scholars, and I fall more on this side, when you really look at what she's writing about, and if you really look at her diaries and her interviews from the time, you can see she's kind of dealing with a lot of ambivalence and a lot of fear about anti-Semitism and rejection from France. So I don't know if you can say it's as simple as saying she's a self-hating Jewish person. It's a very complicated question, which makes her so interesting, I think. And French universalism, for which she came to Paris, comes under crisis in 1940 at the start of the occupation. So in 1940, France was defeated and occupied by the Nazis, and its kind of puppet government collaborated with the Nazis in Jewish persecution. And you can see, very sadly, she died in Auschwitz in 1942. But happily, her story doesn't quite end there, because her daughters survived her, and they inherited a lot of her papers. And one of it was like a little diary, which they could never bring themselves to read. And they decided in the 70s to sit down and read it together. And they realized it was actually a novel and not a diary at all, and which was published in the early 2000s, Suite Française, and became a really big bestseller. So it's, you know, a very, like, almost like a movie kind of story about it. And it really reawakened interest in her. And so I read this and got very interested in her. And then I tried to look into more what other Jewish immigrant authors were writing at the time and what they were writing about World War II. And this, led me to 5 writers in particular. I'm giving just their pen names, but Jean Malache, Elsa Triolet, Romain Gary, and Benjamin Fondan. They were all from different places in Eastern Europe. They were all Jewish writers who came to France in the teens and 20s to become French writers. And they all switched from their languages of origin to write primarily in French. And I follow their experience as Jews, as immigrants, and as writers in France during World War II. And I'm really interested in the way their writing changed during the war. Some rewrote older texts of theirs to show their new positions in France. And some started writing about different topics. For example, some started to write about Jewish identity for the first time during the war, or some started to play with bilingualism. I'm very interested in how they work on language. And I found many texts rewritten or written under the occupation that deal precisely with the questions of Jewishness and Frenchness and language. And so these writers did not stop thinking about their place in France as Jews and as writers and as immigrants. That is, the occupation didn't usher in a silence on their part. And they've often been, the World War II is often skipped over in studies of immigration in France. And so I wanted to show that they didn't stop thinking about these things. And that's why my title is Jewish Emigre Voices. So the desire to find their voices led me to their personal archives, to the different manuscript versions of their literary texts in many cases. And archival materials really brought to life the way these writers questioned and reworked their ideas. Sometimes it's not always obvious when you look at the final version. And I'm just showing an archive that I spent a lot of time in because I love it. It's an interesting placement here because it's by the Pantheon, which is a kind of secular temple to the great men and women of France. And so it really stands for this kind of Republican ideal. And there's a plaque inside for writers who died during World War II, and Nemirovsky. And then the next writer I'm going to talk about, Benjamin Fondan, whose archives are held here. They have their names in the Pantheon, so it's a meaningful location. So I wanted to talk about Benjamin Fondan because I think one of his archival documents really demonstrates a lot of the work I'm doing. And I love this photograph of him. He came to France in the 1920s and was part of the avant-garde. And unfortunately, he died during the war. This is a really amazing document. It's the book he wrote, a long poem, Ulysses, that he published in 1933. And he created a kind of Jewish Ulysses on a 20th century journey to the Americas and beyond, always in exile. You can see during the war, he rewrote it, right? He crossed out the date when it was published. He crossed out the publisher's name, and he creates this kind of new edition because also he couldn't publish openly during the war as a Jewish person who was kind of in semi-hiding. And I don't have here the picture of it, but you can see he crosses out certain parts of the poem and writes in new things. And the published version, if you buy the poem now, has what he changed in the 40s. But if you compare the two, and if you look in the archival manuscript, you see what he changed. So in the 1930s, he has a Jew naturally and yet Ulysses. And there's this idea that, he's writing about alienation and he's trying to put these two things together, right? And then in the 40s, he changes it, makes it much stronger. A Jew naturally, you were a Jew, Ulysses. And so now Jewishness is not a coincidence, but rather a natural part of the condition of travel, of exile, as he portrays it, that there is a kind of alienation of being Jewish. And so I think that a lot of the additions and revisions he made really show his changing experience as a Jew in France. I wanted to mention that other writers in my project had different paths. Two were in the resistance, Romain Gary and Elsa Triolet, and then they survived and went on to have illustrious careers in France and continued to meditate on the role of immigration in France while living there. I won't go through it because I don't have time, but Romain Gary wrote a really wonderful novel, European Education. And during the war, he started to write about Jewish identity. And right at the worst moment when he was rejected as a Jew, as a recently naturalized citizen, because Vichy denaturalized a lot of people, he starts to really think about Jewishness, but in French. And he writes about the resistance, and he incorporates Jewish prayer and Hebrew words into his writing in a way that kind of emphasizes the place that Jews have in the resistance and in his idea of what will be a kind of peaceful European world order after the war. So just tried to give you a sample of some of the very different voices that these people had.
Julie, thank you so much. I could listen to everybody's presentations for hours, and my goodness, do I want to read Ulysse. How would you pronounce that in French? Just Ulysse?
Ulysse.
Ulysse. So do you see the sense of your writers, Jewish identity, you talked about it emerging late for some of them as a topic.
Mm-hmm.
They come to it late. Why do you think that is? Or is that a function of the fact that they could not literally write about it? They were in.
Well, I think it's really interesting Nemirovsky, even though I came to her I got to the project through her. She's kind of the opposite of everyone. I didn't have a chance to say this, but during the interwar period, she wrote so much about Jewish immigration and incorporates so much of Jewish voice, right? About accents and speaking in Yiddish and like the shame of Yiddish. And then Suite Française, which is about World War II. There is not like a single Jewish person in the book. It's not about Jews at all. And so she kind of removes Jews from the story entirely, which is, I think, a kind of way of showing how Jews have been removed from the nation, from the idea of the nation. And she writes in her notes for this, you know, I'm going to really depict France now.
Removed from the nation itself, or from its self-historicizing of its...
Oh, I mean like politically and legally removed from having rights in the nation. Okay. Because very soon after the occupation began, there were Jewish statutes published that kind of stripped people of their rights, stripped Jewish people of their rights. And so I guess I kind of mean in that way, like remove them as you know, members of the nation with civil rights. And but a lot of the other ones kind of begin to write about Jewishness during the war, which is really interesting that, you know, they didn't, a lot of, I mentioned this briefly, a lot of studies about immigration and Jewish people or immigration generally in literature, they kind of are like interwar period and then post-war, as if nothing happened during the war, or it has that effect, but actually like, I mean, it makes sense in a way, but actually this is like a crucial period for people who start to write about Jewishness.
So I was going to ask you that. You mentioned that World War II is skipped over in studies of immigration in France.
Or in studies of literature and immigration, I should say. Yeah.
But you would, so is it the after-war period that's more important? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I think often people talk a lot about like, you know, I mean, Paris was such an amazing center of cultural life in the interwar period, and there's so many people immigrated from all over, right? And then I think, you know, like people weren't coming in and immigrating necessarily during the occupation, but they were still there and still writing. And I think, I'm not always sure why that's forgotten, but it is forgotten that people kept writing and kept thinking about what their role was.
But it would also be a very interesting time to think about what it would mean to even be French. If you are someone who is determined to assimilate, and I'm not assuming that anyone is, but if that is part of your goal. I was taught, for example, I was hosting a retirement party last night for Professor Claudio Katz, who came to America from Argentina at the age of 12. Mm-hmm. And he talks quite directly about his goal was to assimilate.
Yeah.
He doesn't ascribe that goal to his parents, etc., but that was his goal. So if you were thinking about assimilation, you had to think of the identity, and the identity of France itself would be under pressure from occupation and invasion.
Yeah, I mean, Frenchness itself was a very fraught topic for sure while it was being occupied, definitely.
I'm going to let you go in 1 second, but you said that there's a Yiddish phrase for living like God in France.
Yeah.
Do you know it?
Oh, yeah. I probably am saying it with, but Leben wie Gott in Frankreich.
I love it. Okay. When I'm teaching about Louis XIV in the spring, I'll bring that back up. So Professor Le-Khac has talked about that we need to complicate the origin stories, right? To get these narratives, to get the complexity of these narratives. And part of what you've brought forward, especially in the Jewish dimension of your work here, is the idea of displacement itself as a perpetual part of an identity.
Yeah.
As being always expelled.
Yeah, I think you see that a lot in Fondan, in his writing about exile and displacement, that his book, a different poem that I talk about is called Exodus, and it's kind of imagines Jewish history as like a never-ending cycle of displacement. And he wrote he started writing this poem before World War II, and then he rewrote it during the war. It's another thing he rewrote, and he made like the center part of it about World War II, and that as that being kind of the like, it all swirls around the war, but that this is like part of a never-ending cycle of displacement, and that also that has a major part of Jewish identity, but mainly for him, a major part of the Jewish poet's identity, that the Jewish poet is someone who poeticizes exile in a sense and sees this exile and sees the cycles of history.
That's fantastic. I will take us to Professor Guha now. I almost said Dr. Malini, because that's what I normally call you. Dr. Guha, to talk to us about the kind of a British context, also 20th century, but later on.
Thanks, Dr. Strain, and thanks for bringing us all together in this fantastic conversation. So, I am going to talk about Britain, but before I do that, I'm going to begin by talking to you about where I'm speaking from. And so this is going to be my entry point for answering the question of how I came to research and write about fictional films, as well as documentaries that address different facets of a post-colonial experience in Britain and in France. So, I'm speaking to you from the city of Toronto in Canada. Toronto is located on the traditional lands of many Indigenous peoples and nations, including the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was the subject of what is known as the Dish with the One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Confederacy and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. In making this acknowledgement, I'm honoring the original custodians of this land, while also acknowledging that this place that we call Canada is a settler colonial nation that has come into being through the violent colonization and genocide of Indigenous peoples, so First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. I also wish to honor the struggles of Indigenous peoples in the present in Canada and their struggles for a decolonial, just, and liberated future. My family arrived to Toronto in the late 1960s, and I was born here. My family was part of a wave of non-white immigration to Canada during this time period from various parts of the world, including India. They became part of a diasporic community in Toronto, made up of many different individuals and families who migrated from the province of Bengal in India to Toronto during the 60s and the 70s. So diaspora is one of those important terms, and it generally pertains to people and communities who have left their homelands, sometimes not that long ago, but sometimes many generations ago, but continue to retain strong connections to their cultural, ethnic, sometimes religious, and linguistic pasts. So while my family members all gave up their Indian citizenship eventually to become Canadian, and technically speaking, I'm Canadian, I now refer to myself as an immigrant settler or a settler of color. Sometimes it makes sense to flag that I am also a woman of color, depending on the circumstances. I'm someone who's gone by many different identities, including East Indian, now South Asian, I don't know what's next. So there are a few threads that we can pull from this story that I've told you about myself. So the first is that I do think there is a link between my personal history and the research that I've pursued, although I've only recently started to think and write about migration and settler colonialism in a Canadian context. Most of my work has centered on films that address patterns of migration in Britain and in France after the end of their respective empires, so meaning after the end of the Second World War. And so during this time period, people who belong to nations that were once colonized by Britain and France began to arrive and settle in British and French cities and regions as a result of labor shortages, and gradually immigration policies became increasingly restricted. The second thread that we can pull from my story concerns the question of identity and the way in which racial identities of migrant and diasporic peoples, or the question of how we see ourselves and how we are seen by others, shifts and changes depending on our relationships with the places where we currently reside, the places from where we have come, and the question of how we imagine ourselves in relationship to a broader world. As many scholars have noted, racial identity is always a matter of becoming, and it is a process that is never finished. To return to my own story, I began to call myself an immigrant settler once I began to understand what it meant to be a person of color in a settler colonial state, and very specifically what it meant to not be Black and Indigenous in a settler colonial state. And thinking of myself like that is very different from thinking of myself as Canadian or thinking of myself as South Asian. As many people have argued, people like me often remain on the margins of projects of nation building in Canada because of my race. But at the same time, I am complicit with such an agenda by virtue of my status as Canadian citizen, who partakes of the privileges of such a position in ways that are not afforded to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples in Canada. So building upon these two threads, I'm going to present you with a third and final one, which has to do with the importance of cinema and moving image work more broadly, among other forms of artistic expression, to the experiences of migration and diaspora. So I'm going to share my screen now. As has been pointed out by filmmakers and scholars alike, there are not a lot of monuments or even memorials that commemorate the experience of migration and the formation of diasporas in Britain, France, and we can add Canada to the mix here, US as well. In these areas of the world, monuments have often been reserved for men who have perpetuated the slave trade, who were instrumental in the projects of imperialism, white supremacy, and genocide. And in various historical moments, including the one we are currently living through, these monuments are pulled to the ground, decapitated, and thrown into bodies of water as gestures of resistance against the memorialization of these figures in public space. Alongside of the lack of monuments or memorials, archival documentation in the forms of photographs, writing, moving images about migration and diaspora have not always been readily available in the public domain, although that is changing. But prior to this time, a lot of this material that does exist is preserved in public archives that are not always easy to access, or you find material in personal archives, in amateur videos, or in private collections of photographs. So in this context, there are filmmakers who view the cinema and other kinds of moving image work, television, moving image installation as privileged sites for engaging with the experience of monumentalizing and memorializing migration and diaspora, particularly in places like Britain and France, which were radically transformed by the migration of people from former colonies. As film scholar Nora Alter has put it, the relationship between history and memory, the creation of counter-narratives, the reclamation of a disappeared past, and the establishment of an archive in the absence of records are themes confronting the diasporic filmmaker. So there are many examples one could discuss, some of which have become the subject of my own research. Black British filmmaker Janna, for example, and that's him right here, has always been preoccupied with this question of the lack of monuments or public memorials that commemorate the experiences of migration from the Caribbean and South Asia to Britain in the post-imperial period. So he's tried to address this lack across his work, often by digging up archival traces that remain of these experiences in the form of moving images and photographs, and using them in his films. In one film called The Nine Muses, he renders these experiences of migration to Britain as analogous to Homer's Odyssey and to other Western myths that memorialize, celebrate, and revere the epic journey. So many people from the Caribbean who are arriving to Britain in the late 1940s and in the 1950s arrived by ship, and the most famous being the arrival of the Empire Windrush to Britain in 1948. So as Compra says in an interview, quote, "I wanted to find a way of elevating an experience that's not usually talked about in epic terms. For me, 1 million people traveling 4,000 or 5,000 miles by boat to reach their destination, that's Homeric. It's the stuff of the Odyssey." A second example involves a group of films that were set in the city of London, and they were made primarily by Black British filmmakers in the 1970s and in the 80s. So these were mostly fictional films, but they engaged directly with the circumstances of Black British life and identity. So across many of these films, the streets of London signify a site of danger for Black male protagonists in particular, as they are surveyed and hunted by the police by virtue of their presence in public space where they are deemed criminal by default, always already criminal. At the same time, the street is situated in these films also as sites of resistance against anti-Black racism, often in the form of public protest. So the street then is a site where the longing of a better future is staged. As cultural studies scholar Stuart Hall once put it, the cultural formations created by those who were arriving from the Caribbean to Britain in the post-war period is nothing less than, quote, "a mark and a sign that they are the people of the future." Viewing migrants and later diasporic populations as the people of the future is a direct response to the idea that migrants are problems or criminals or the unwanted, that they don't belong. Instead, these populations were engaged with the struggles and pleasures of world building in their new homes, including participating in the remaking of British and French nations in the aftermath of the devastation that was wrought by the Second World War. So I will close now by saying that perhaps the cinema and the moving image more broadly is better suited to the remembrance of these stories than a physical monument. Monuments are static, and as scholar W.T. Mitchell argues, they want to defeat history with their pretensions towards the eternal. But the migrant and diasporic experience is fluid, oriented towards the past as much as these experiences gesture towards a future time. We can argue that the moving image is better able to capture this experience of migration as a form of mobility, but also the feeling of this experience, which can often be one of disruption, of being in flux, and of being fundamentally unsettled. Cinema is a medium that can oscillate more easily between and across different facets of time and space, and it can do so in ways that physical monuments cannot. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much. I think that was such a compelling account of what cinema can do that you ended on there, Dr. Guha. I also think you've added more terms for us to think of. If we can think of all of these talks actually as building on Professor Le-Khac's initial outline, right, of the conception of origins and the future, the past and the future, and the here and the there. So in addition to the idea of an immigrant or a refugee, you've given us the settler, and the immigrant as settler. Can you tell me, because this isn't, I'm going to go away thinking about this because I haven't thought about that term, Dr. Guha. When you say immigrant settler, I think I understand it's got to have, that term has to have a pastness and a present to it, in the sense that you talked about being implicated in the privileges and structures that you were benefiting from this colonial past, but also settler in the present.
Yeah.
In the sense that, like I just got my green card this summer after 10 years of working in America. I'm finally an immigrant after being here for 10 years from a legal definition. And I hope to stay. I am very settled in my ways. Do you know what I mean? So the process of settling, and that has a whole other funny dimension too. But no, the process of being a settler would be an ongoing process as well.
Yes, it would be.
Yeah. So this is I'm just so interested in everything. Dr. Guha, I'm trying to very awkwardly make links between these talks, but you got us from Professor Le-Khac's distinction between looking at the past and the future in terms of immigration, and Professor Elsky's focus on movement, on liminal states. And so I think we'll move on to Professor Vagalau's talk, and I think she'll cover some geographical territory that you do in your work.
Thank you, Professor Strain, and thank you to all for participating in this. We do have some overlap, at least geographically, with Professor Guha. But I think that actually it's interesting, the dichotomy between the two types of narratives you were just describing. I have been drawn to narratives that actually work against that and try to break it down. So it'll be even harder for you, Virginia, to together our talk, a little wrench in your project. So my general area is Caribbean studies and French, and I have progressively moved towards authors who have begun writing in the 70s, 80s, who have all, not all, but many of whom have written in exile. And specifically Haitian authors who, part of a large generation of intellectuals, had to flee Haiti because of the Duvalier dictatorship, either because of direct threats or indirect threats. As I was looking into this corpus, and before I move on, actually, I think like many of us or all of us, there's certainly a personal link in that I myself I'm an immigrant. I left when I was 16 and then 18 and then kept moving around, and Virginia, 23 years beats 10. And so I've definitely sought authors who could help with my own questions on how to gather an imploded subjectivity, that is that of the migrant. And eventually this led me to Jean-Claude Chartres, and I will speak about him specifically tonight because he has occupied my, has become my focus for the last 10 years or so, especially because he's sort of a missing link in Haitian literary studies. His work operated a shift both stylistically and ideologically in Haitian literature, but for a number of reasons I can guess or propose. His works fell into sort of into the shadows, I will say, for a while. And for the last 5 years or so, it has a publishing house in Montreal has begun republishing all of it. And so he's once again gaining momentum and being read and studied and so on. So I will share my screen if I figure out how to. Okay. Okay. So Jean-Claude Charles was born in 1949 in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and he worked as a journalist, and then, like many of his generation, fled the country, which first landed him in Mexico for a little while, and then spent most of his life between Paris and New York, but also on numerous other journeys throughout the world. He worked in Paris for Le Monde, and so that in itself allowed him to travel and write. And he produced an amazing body of work, very varied. Everything from poetry, négociation, essays, de ces jolies petites places, le cochon, Le Corps Noir, novels, Manhattan Blues, and others. These are just the ones that have been republished. A wonderful, this was published, Basket was published posthumously. It's a chronicle of the road of blues in the US, so starting from New York all the way down to the South. The principle, the main themes with which she's preoccupied are also very different. His entire body of work is in fact haunted by the memory of Haiti. So De si jolies petites plages, for example, deals with the plight of the boat people coming into the US, but also with racism. And Le Corps Noir is a very complex essay on the kinds of stereotypical images that have been throughout the centuries imprinted onto Black bodies. And to call it an essay is perhaps to do it not to do it justice. It includes lyrical passages, it includes references to pop culture, but also literary analyses. It's a very, it has been described as a sort of rhizomatic essay, and as it came out the same year as Deleuze's Anti-Oedipus, so it sort of makes sense. Manhattan Blues takes on the Reagan years in New York and is mostly preoccupied with consumer society and capitalism. The following novel is set in Paris and takes on Paris, and so quite an area of thematic interest. But the one notion that subtends all of it is his own version of transnationalism, I'm going to say. And in discussing it, it was first mentioned, the term was first mentioned in Le Corps Noir, and then he never quite explained it, so to speak, until a very late interview. But this is in sort of his response to being called a migrant writer or an exile writer or even a world citizen, etc. And so in response to all of those labels and categorizations, he created his own and refused everything else. And so I have a little quote from this interview in which he explains that the concept of itinerance is deliberately oxymoronic. It simultaneously takes into account both the roots and errantry. It speaks to both the memory of origins and the new realities of migration. It marks a taking root in errantry. No other term I could have adopted suits me. And so just to explain, it truly is, taking root in errantry would truly be the way to translate the neologism. Racine means root. Enraciner is the action of taking root, right? And errance is errantry or wandering. But I've always preferred keeping the term errantry because of the double meaning of right? So both to wander, but also to perhaps be mistaken. And so, and knowing Charles' insistence on these tensions and on his desire to confront his condition with full consciousness and with all of its errors and wanderings. I'm particularly attached to the term errantry. And so truly this concept underlies everything from the poems to the novels to the essays, and allowed him to explore all of these themes perhaps together, which seems like quite the feat. My interest, so my question then became, what is, or what could be, is there any fixed point in this kind of errantry, right? Because we're no longer in that dynamic of leaving the homeland and settling in the new land. We are in permanent movement with itinerance, and movement is sort of the goal. And not just with Jean-Claude Charles, but with other writers of from the Caribbean, and I'm thinking of Dany Ferrière, but also of Marie Condé. What I've been able to find is that ultimately is the act of creation that provides a sort of possibility of dealing with this permanent movement, with this incessant wandering. And he describes writing in terms of the potomiton. And so the potomiton is the central column of a voodoo temple. And so he says writes the following, rather, I think that as long as I will have the strength to move, I will move. But there is always a potomiton. The potomiton is the central column of the voodoo temple, the central point of a circular structure, where one always returns, the point towards which centripetal forces go, the forces gathering towards the center, in opposition to centrifugal forces, which push away from the center and which are forces of dispersion. There's always a type of dialectic between these two movements that allows for a relative mastery of the potomiton. So this potomiton is there in the foraging work of the writer, in the work of literature. It is not somewhere in life. It is not connected to a Parisian or New York type of ambition, nor to a properly Haitian one. I move in writing and I write in movement. And the image you see in the background, I had a little fun with this presentation, are some of his notebooks. because after his passing, his family has been receiving lots of boxes from people with whom he had been staying throughout the world, filled with boxes of notebooks and manuscripts and so on. And what you see in the middle there are old metro tickets on which he also wrote. So there is clearly this this need to write is very evident also in the objects left behind. And to me, I wasn't fully satisfied with this idea that engagement, the only engagement of this perpetual movement, could be the creative act. So I was trying to figure out what exactly, what could political engagement look like for someone who never ceases moving. And he eventually explains it to us with the following. The only question that ever mattered to me is to have the feeling that I'm producing some relatively identifiable flying objects in which I take the side of men and women, of the men and women who are prevented from circulating, for example, who are stopped, turned away, locked up, in which I take the side of those who suffer under the weight of an unjust world. And indeed, all of his work is traversed by this desire to take on all borders and push against all borders, be they those separating nations to prison bars. He also produced a few documentaries about the incarcerated Haitian incarcerated children in on U.S. territory, as well as all the labels and separations, be they gendered or racial, etc. So, in a sense, I'm going to stop sharing. I wouldn't say that this is these are studies in migration, truly. It is a different way of perceiving the problem. But I will probably stop here and leave the rest for questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Vagalau. I think there was continuity here between your presentation and the last one with this focus on movement, right? And not just how do you represent that, but how do you grapple with it? I think that was a great question that you gave our attendees. What does political action look like for someone who is always moving, right? And the answer you gave us was a perpetual push against, you said borders, but I think perhaps you meant boundaries of any kind. Yeah. So this takes us, everyone has done a really great job of introducing terminology and defining it. So to pick up on the last part of your discussion, and I'll open this up to everybody, I'll ask, Charles is a journalist, and I'm wondering about, and Dr. Guha talked about a filmmaker who was also a documentarian, correct? And so I'm wondering about to what degree do these writers and filmmakers employ stylistic choices and fiction as a way of grappling with that perpetual movement. To what degree do these writers rely on, or filmmakers rely on, realism, for lack of a better word, versus any kind of escapist world building efforts, fantasy? I mean, one way that you could look at that is Professor Elsky, for example, in the novel that she mentioned at the end, which was The Suite Française, has absolutely no Jewish people. And we could even look at that as, in a sense, a kind of fantasy or escapist experiment.
Was this question for me, or was it a general?
For everybody. If you have an answer, you go for it.
No, I'm happy to actually. I think it's no mistake that two of the most prominent writers of that generation from Haiti were both journalists, both Charles and Daniela Ferrière, and that that their training as journalists actually traverses very clearly into their novels, but only in the sense that their style is characterized by very quick-witted, sharp, clear sentences. But to call the style realistic would be, it doesn't correspond at all. One thing that does, however, speak to, I think, the problem you're posing is the use of autofiction. Right, and so that documentary and angle, but it is always complicated by fiction, and it is always complicated by fantasy. So that would be my if I understand your question correctly.
Dr. Le-Khac, oh, go ahead, Dr. Guha.
Okay, it could be anybody, but I was just thinking, you know, the Black British films I was talking about, the ones made in the 70s and 80s that feature the street in various ways. Yeah, those films definitely use a realist style. And I was really drawn to those films for that reason. And the other thing is they were shot on location. And so that's really, really interesting. So they're all shot in areas of Black settlement in London. So Brixton, you know, Notting Hill, places like that. And there are a lot of announcements of place, actually, that resonate across these films, or sections just dedicated to showcasing place. So realism is a really significant factor in these films. And so it's like, you know, they're fictionalizing things that were happening. So there's a kind of allegorical impetus to these films as well.
Allegorical, or are they recording? You said,
yeah, it's both.
They're depicting things that are happening, right? And the present, you know, that's another aspect of time that we should consider, right? If we look at origins and we look at this future, using the apparatus that Professor Le-Khac gave us. This is different from monumentalizing.
It is different from monumentalizing, but it does feel like a gesture towards remembrance. Mm. Yeah. So it's not monumentalizing, but it does seem to, it seems to me anyway, when I watch these films now, that they're preserving a sense of place, and one that is tied very, very specifically to Black identity, particularly the way Brixton is represented across a lot of this work. And it's represented quite similarly across very different films made in this period. So no, not monumentalizing, but certainly there are gestures toward remembrance there.
Brixton is a great thing to bring up because we do, whether it's England or America, we have this, or Canada, as you know, we have this experience of neighborhoods or suburbs or urban environments that are quote unquote Little Italy, or, you know, Little India or whatever. That dimension of the experience hasn't come into our talk yet, right? That immigrant or that refugee in this larger, smaller pocket, and what role does the pocket play? One of the things that Canada did, it had camps for Japanese Canadians in World War II. And after World War II, the Canadian policy deliberately dispersed Japanese Canadians across Canada with a deliberate attempt to demolish their potential to create community. Right? That pocket, that community was understood as a threat. And so those are powerful identities as well. And I think Professor Guha, we've talked about that in terms of the Canadian Indian community and the British one as having different cultural tastes in terms of dance, right? And their different associations and politicization of that. Does anyone else want to weigh into that? Like we can think about immigration as an individual experience, but we can also think of it as a group experience. I'm talking a lot, but Professor Elsky, I was listening to everyone's presentation. Professor Elsky was talking about the rewriting of the epic as a Jewish experience, right? But if you think about something like the problem, Homer becomes big in the 1800s. Before that, it was Virgil and it was the Aeneid. And the Aeneid might star Aeneas, but Aeneas took everyone with him. He took all of the survivors of the burning of Troy, right? It's not actually about one hero who finds a homeland. It's someone who was charged with the obligation of creating a new homeland for this entire people. And it's easy to lose sight of that because the text focuses on him, of course. But in the background are ships, are families, you know? So where was I going with this? Oh, just this idea of the immigrant or even the exile or the refugee in this community. That seems to me something that we should probably try and get at.
I could say his poem does include a lot of that. I didn't have a chance to mention it, but it's not like this one figure, but it's like on a ship of immigrants. But another writer I work on who talks a lot about accent. I mean, he doesn't talk about it. He portrays it a lot in his novel, The War Jean Malache. But in thinking about his use of accent, I work on a little bit, a theorist, Alan Fleischer, who talks about accents as both the thing that makes you stand apart, but also the thing that links you to a group of people, right? And so it's like individual and collective at once, an accent. So accents can be a really rich way of thinking about that as well, I think.
I mean, this came out last night too when I was talking with Professor Claudio Katz about moving to America, right? Language is inescapably central to this experience of being a part or the same. Professor Le-Khac, did you want to weigh in on any of these?
Your point about sites and communities, I think is really important. Like one of the things that is really striking in a lot of the refugee fiction I look at in Latinx and Asian American literature is that they are not individually centered narrative structures, that they are often short story collections that like give a panorama of an ethnic enclave of a community. And then as I was mentioning in the presentation, they cut back and forth, past and present, like other countries in the US. And it's through their narrative form, they're essentially making this argument that every ethnic enclave that is the formation of migration is a site of global history, right? It's not just a locality, right? That it is a presence within the US, a site within the US that estranges the US from itself and forces the US to see and confront its own international histories, why those peoples are here, what forces and histories created a little Saigon or whatever it is, right? So that they're not just localities, they're also incredibly capacious and expansive in their historical potential. And because of that, their artistic potential for like expanding the scope of a story.
You also, though, in the works that I think that's a great. I'm so glad you talked about the short story collection and what the form can enable. The idea that we can shift between focusing between different characters and places like that. In the work that you study, though, language must also come up, and accents and idiom. When Train Spotting came out, it was a huge deal in contemporary literary culture, in part because of the Scottish Brogue, because of the representation of regional dialect. And it has been credited with a kind of revival or an increased interest in doing that kind of writing, trying to represent the voice of people in a stronger way that would be challenging to a non-native person, a person not from Scotland. What kind of linguistic, stylistic experiments do you come across, or is there what role does and I can ask that to all of you, right? What role does stylistic, linguistic, formal experiment have in this kind of subject matter?
Yeah, so the writer I raised during presentation, Juno Diaz, I mean, if you know his work, like, you know that he's doing like something really radical with language in his prose. One of the things he does is he refuses to italicize Spanish. It's like a thoroughly bilingual text that does not mark languages apart from each other. And his argument there is obviously that there is a new language forming here. It is a kind of Spanglish. And it is not, one of his kind of points is that it's not foreign, is that it's an indigenous US creation. I met with the scholar Rebecca Walkowitz once, who teaches at Rutgers, and Juno Diaz is from northern New Jersey. That's where he settled with his family. And when she was teaching Drown to her students, the thing that was remarkable to her was that they were like, oh yeah, we hear this language in the street all the time. This is like how we talk. It was like it was completely familiar to them. It was like a hyper-local amalgamation of English and Spanish, Black vernacular, and all these different languages that comes out of a particular migrant history of Dominican Americans that settled in northern New Jersey. It's a new American language, and he's making that argument by refusing to italicize, refusing to translate anything. Right?
Did anyone else want to? So in a sense, it might be a literary experiment, but what it's trying to get at is something, is the living language. Yeah. Other encounters like that, Malini?
Yeah, the film that I was talking about, one of the films I was talking about, The Nine Muses by Janna Compra, I think that's a really good example. He used to be part of a film collective called Black Audio Film Collective. And, they're basically Black British filmmakers working in a collective structure in London during the workshop era, where they had funding to basically make experimental films collectively that were shown on television. So they were shown on Channel 4. And that in itself is kind of phenomenal, like to show experimental films on TV. Whoa, we don't do that anymore. But it was interesting because they worked in a collective fashion, and their aim was to invent a new aesthetic language, a new form of filmmaking that would convey the experience of diaspora. And so what is very interesting about what they do is, they also move between the past and the present in very interesting ways. And it's often by using archival film footage and then kind of placing it in a contemporary situation, or asking you to think about the contemporary situation vis-a-vis the archive and vis-a-vis the past. So it's a very good example. And in the film that I was talking about, The Nine Muses, made by Janna Compra, who used to be part of this collective, he went into an archive and he found all of these archival documentary images of Black and brown people working, basically, after they had migrated to Britain in the post-war period. but a lot of these images had a fairly racist soundtrack to go with them. And so what he did was he removed the soundtrack so that he can in some ways reclaim the image as, you know, a kind of archive of these stories of migration and diaspora. And he added other kinds of sounds to them.
Can you explain what the original was for me? You said an image, so I was imagining like a picture, but there's a soundtrack. So it was film?
They were documentaries, yeah.
Documentaries,
yeah,
that predate this collective.
Yes.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. Yes.
Were they official films by the British government, by the British film industry, by BBC?
I think there were different sources. Yeah. So some of the stuff was definitely news footage. They also used some archival things, and like, yes, some of it was definitely made for television. The thing is, when you're watching the films, you don't get the sources because what he's doing is he's taking away the soundtracks. Because if he were to keep the soundtracks in, basically they would be profoundly racist, and they were making profoundly racist statements about these people and their jobs and whatnot.
Do you think the original audience for these films recognized them and recognized the what he was doing to them, what he took away from them, how he reappropriated them?
To be honest, I mean, a contemporary audience, it might be difficult to understand the context.
To his contemporary audience.
Yeah. The film was
that's
made
avant-garde for you. So that's something we haven't addressed either yet, really, is the fact that an immigrant or a refugee or an emigre is coming into a situation which already has preconceived conceptions about who they are. That where do these artists that you guys work on reappropriate that and redeploy it? When is that the strategy?
If I go back to the accent thing with Jean Malache, who's one of the writers I work on, but who I didn't speak about at length, he really takes back the idea of Jewish and Yiddish accents from the mockery of the anti-Semitic press and kind of shows it to be, you know, expressions of love or of play, and kind of takes back a lot of tropes of, the things people would say about Yiddish accents and the mockery of Jewish men as emasculated, or to show them in situations of love and of play. Yeah.
Do you any, I want to, we're at an hour and a half point. And so I just want to open the floor if any of you have any questions for each other or anybody in our audience.
I have a question for the other three panelists, but I'd rather turn it over to the audience first.
Go right ahead, Dr. Le-Khac.
Okay, one of the things that's really struck me was, okay, in Professor Guha's presentation, this film, The Nine Muses. And then in Professor Elsky's presentation, this Ulysses, right, text that rewrites Homer. Both of them are rewriting Homer in some way. And then in Professor Vagalau's presentation, I was wondering whether that term around errantry has, in his mind, goes back to this very old French literary tradition of the knight errant, the romances, the Arthurian romances, right? So I'm trying to think about how in the writers and filmmakers you're looking at, they are reappropriating incredibly foundational cultural lineages of their host quote unquote countries and just changing it in a way to make them more expansive for migrant lives. And it just seems very radical to go right to Homer and make him Jewish, go right to Homer and make him a migrant exile, and really rethink that these normally we think of those epics as founding nations rather than centering us on unstabilized movement, errantry, constant movement, right?
For sure. And I think in the case of the Nine Muses, so yeah, partly it's the Odyssey. But then what happens is, so as I was saying, the racist soundtracks of the films, the original archival footage is removed. And then you have voiceover narration. And so sometimes it's the Odyssey, but sometimes it's Milton. Sometimes it's Shakespeare. And so he moves across the Western canon. And partly what's going on in that film is the way you're talking about it, in terms of rewriting foundational narratives and making them signify something else, but also the way he talks about it anyway, the filmmaker. It's about reclaiming these stories as stories that belong to these migrants, specifically because when they were coming to Britain in the late 40s and in the 50s, they were technically still British citizens. And that was a right that was taken away from them gradually through various acts of legislation. And so for him, part of it is about saying that Western canon is our canon too.
That point about foundations is really important, right? The way that literature has been used, and I don't typically think of mainstream films used as asserting political foundations, but certainly film has been used propagandistically. Yeah, I think I'd better not try to say anything. But I think we should probably wrap this up because I've kept you here into the wee hours of Paris. And Professor Vagalau especially, thank you for being with us and sharing your work on Haitian writers with us. Professor Le-Khac, I look forward to seeing you around the department if we ever go back to our offices. And Professor Guha, if the borders ever open and I ever get back into Toronto. And Professor Elsky, if you ever come back from fellowships. But I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this. I so look forward to being able to put together a bibliography for this talk to accompany the video. Thank you so much for your time and insights and sharing your incredible work and the sharing with us the writers and the filmmakers that you work on and telling us about them. So, and that's it. Take care wherever you all are.